It was a cold night, one that seemed to stretch on forever. The wind howled through the cracks of the old farmhouse, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and the distant echo of the animals in the barn. But inside, there was no warmth, no comfort, and for young Emily, this night would be unlike any other. Imagine being forced to sleep in a place that no human should ever have to. A place where the ground was cold and muddy, where the air reeked of animal waste, and the only companions you had were pigs, the same creatures you had once seen from a distance, but never expected to share a space with. Yet that's exactly where Emily found herself. Her stepmother, a woman who had never shown her kindness, had made it clear. "You don't belong in the house." These weren't just words. They were a sentence, one that would lead Emily into a nightmare she couldn't escape from. It wasn't always like this. Emily remembered a time when her life had been simple. Her father had been loving and attentive, always making sure she felt safe and cared for. But everything changed when he remarried. Suddenly, her stepmother, who seemed so sweet at first, turned into someone Emily couldn't recognize. The warmth that had once filled their home slowly vanished, replaced by cruelty that Emily had never expected to come from someone who was supposed to care for her. At first, it was small things, comments about her appearance, the way she cleaned her room, or the food she ate. But over time, the demands grew harsher. Emily was expected to do all the housework, all the chores, while her stepmother sat comfortably by the fire. And whenever Emily failed to meet her expectations, the punishment was swift and harsh. One evening, when Emily had been particularly tired from working all day, her stepmother's cruelty reached a boiling point. After a minor mistake, Emily was sent to the barn, not to sleep in the warm house, but to the cold, dark pigsty. "You'll sleep with the pigs tonight," her stepmother had said, the words cutting deeper than any punishment she had given before. Emily could hardly believe it. The barn was a dirty place, filled with the sharp scent of pigs and the unbearable cold of the night. She had no blanket, no cushion, only the straw on the ground and the animals surrounding her. As the door slammed shut, leaving her in the suffocating darkness, Emily couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. She wasn't just an outsider in the house anymore. She was an outcast, forced to share her bed with creatures she had once thought of as beneath her. The pigs snorted in the darkness, the sound grating on her nerves. The cold seeped into her bones, and her stomach growled with hunger. It was a cruel and unusual punishment, but Emily knew there was no way out. Her father, once her protector, had grown distant, his attention consumed by his new wife, and now he couldn't even look at her without disappointment. Emily was alone, but she wasn't just afraid of the physical discomfort. It was the emotional toll that hurt the most, the constant feeling of being unwanted, unloved. Her stepmother's actions made her question everything. What had happened to the life she once knew? What had happened to the father who used to hold her close and tell her everything would be all right? As the hours dragged on, Emily's thoughts became a blur. She tried to ignore the pigs that shuffled around her, the cold that made her body ache, and the growing sense of hopelessness that settled in her chest. She had no idea how much longer she could endure this torment, but she refused to give up. She would fight, even if it meant doing so alone. But what Emily didn't know was that her suffering was far from over. What her stepmother had in store for her next was far more than she could imagine. Something dark, something unforgiving, would come to light in the coming days. A secret that would change everything. The night seemed endless, the hours ticking by like slow torture. But even in that darkness, something inside Emily began to. A stir, a spark of rebellion, a flicker of hope that somehow she might be able to change her fate. Would she endure the cruelty and fight back? Or would she be broken by the weight of her circumstances? As the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Emily lay on the cold ground, her body sore and her mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. One thing was clear: this was only the beginning. And as for her stepmother, her plans were far from over. But Emily's story, her fight for freedom, was just beginning. Would she find a way out, or would the forces against her break her spirit for good? Stay tuned for the next part of this heartbreaking journey, because the worst may still be to come. The morning light came too soon, casting an eerie glow over the barn. The bitter cold was still biting, and Emily lay there, her eyes wide open, staring at the wooden beams above her, trying to block out the reality of her situation. The pigs were quiet now, except for the occasional grunt, but their presence only seemed to add to the suffocating atmosphere. She could feel the weight of her stepmother's cruelty hanging in the air, thick and oppressive. But Emily's mind was racing. She couldn't just stay here, not like this. Something had to change. She had spent years hoping her father would come to her rescue, but he had become a stranger in his own home. He no longer saw the little girl he had once adored. Instead, he was lost in his own world, manipulated by his new wife. He had become weak, unable to see the truth of what was happening under his own roof. And that made Emily's heart ache. Her stepmother, on the other hand, had always been a force to be reckoned with. She was cold, calculating, and above all, controlling. Emily couldn't remember a time when the woman had shown even a hint of kindness. She seemed to thrive on power, getting satisfaction from breaking Emily down, making her feel small and insignificant. It wasn't just about the physical punishment, but the emotional toll, constantly being reminded that she didn't belong, that she was nothing more than a nuisance in her stepmother's eyes. It was like a never-ending storm, one that had begun the day her father had married her. And yet, there were times when Emily could almost see a flicker of something else in her stepmother's eyes, something darker. She had moments when she would look at Emily with a strange intensity, as if studying her. But Emily couldn't understand it. Was it jealousy, anger, or something deeper, something more dangerous? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that it terrified her. The barn was silent now, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her stepmother was watching her. Her mind kept drifting back to the night before, to those horrible words, "You'll sleep with the pigs tonight." It was as if her stepmother had found a new way to assert her dominance, pushing Emily further into despair. The thought of being locked away in that filthy pigsty, with no escape, made her skin crawl. But even in the midst of her fear, Emily couldn't ignore the one thing that kept her going: the will to survive. She knew she couldn't let this be the end. She would find a way out, no matter what it took. But escape wasn't easy, and the more she thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. Her father, once her protector, had become a shadow of the man he used to be. He was no longer the caring father she had known, the one who had promised to always protect her. The truth was, he had changed. Perhaps he didn't even realize it, but his attention was consumed by his new wife. She had wormed her way into his life, making him blind to the suffering happening right under his nose. How could he not see what was happening to his daughter? Every night, Emily would lie awake, her mind spinning with thoughts of how to escape. She dreamed of running away, of finding somewhere far from the cruelty of her stepmother and the indifference of her father. But where would she go? What would she do? She had no money, no resources, and the world outside the farm felt vast and unknown. As the days passed, Emily's situation grew more dire. The punishments from her stepmother became more frequent, more severe. It was as if nothing she did could ever be good enough. No matter how hard she worked or how obedient she tried to be, it was never enough. Her stepmother's demands grew, and the toll on Emily's body and mind became unbearable. She would be sent out to do the hardest chores, forced to work long hours in the cold, only to return to the barn or be locked in a dark room with nothing but her thoughts and the relentless sound of her stepmother's voice echoing in her head. The tension between Emily and her stepmother was building. But there was more at play here than just cruelty. Beneath the surface, there was a deep simmering conflict that Emily couldn't quite understand. It was as if her stepmother was intent on breaking her spirit, on making her feel worthless. But why? What was the root of all this hatred? Emily had never done anything to provoke her. She was just a young girl, trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush her. Then came the night that would change everything. It was a quiet evening, the sky dark and heavy with clouds, and Emily was working in the fields, exhausted, beyond belief. Her body ached, and she could feel her spirit beginning to wear thin. As she finished the last of her chores, she saw her stepmother standing by the door, watching her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. There was something different about the way her stepmother was looking at her, something colder, more calculating. "You've been a burden to this family long enough," her stepmother said, her voice as cold as ice. "I've had enough of your disobedience. You think you deserve more than this. You think you're better than the pigs." The words hit Emily like a slap. She stood frozen, unsure of what to say. But the fear began to creep in again, deep and suffocating. Her stepmother stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Tonight, you will sleep in the barn again. But this time, I'm locking the door. No more wandering, no more running away in your little fantasies. You belong here, and you'll learn your place." For a moment, Emily's breath caught in her throat. The same fear she had felt the night before rose again, but this time, it was different. Something inside her snapped. Could she really take this any longer? Could she survive another night, another day under her stepmother's oppressive rule? The fire of resistance that had been smoldering inside her for so long was beginning to burn brighter. Emily knew that she couldn't just sit back and let this continue. The darkness was closing in, but Emily was finally ready to fight back. That night, something changed in Emily. As her stepmother's cold words echoed in her ears, the walls of fear that had held her captive for so long began to crumble. For the first time, she felt a surge of defiance, a burning resolve to not let herself be broken any longer. The thought of spending another night in that barn, of being locked away with the pigs, was too much to bear. She had to do something, anything to escape the nightmare that had become her life. As the door to the barn slammed shut behind her, Emily's heart raced. The familiar smell of straw and manure filled the air, but tonight, it didn't feel like the same place. This time, Emily wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter. She paced back and forth in the dark, her mind spinning with possibilities, trying to think of a way out. Her stepmother was cruel, yes, but Emily knew her well, enough to understand her weaknesses. The more she thought, the clearer her plan became. Her stepmother might have locked her in the barn, but she hadn't thought to lock the window. It was small, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. But Emily had an idea. She had spent countless hours watching the animals in the barn, studying their movements, and learning the ropes of the farm. She knew the layout, the weak spots, and the places where things were hidden. Her stepmother's overconfidence in locking her away had left an opening that Emily could use to her advantage. With trembling hands, Emily pried at the old window, the wood creaking in protest as she worked to free it. It took every ounce of strength and determination she had left, but finally, After what felt like an eternity, the window gave way. She didn't hesitate. Emily squeezed through the small opening, her heart pounding as she crawled into the night, the cool night. Air hit her face, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know where she would go, but she knew she couldn't stay there. The farm, the house, the cruelty, it all had to be left behind. She couldn't let her stepmother control her anymore. She had to escape, to find her own way, even if she had to do it alone. But as she ran through the fields, every step feeling like a victory, a sudden noise stopped her in her tracks. Footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the shadows of the barn, was her father. Emily froze, unsure of what to do. Was he here to stop her, to take her back to the hell she had just escaped from? But instead of anger, she saw something else in his eyes. Regret. His face was etched with worry, and his voice trembled when he spoke. "Emily, where are you going?" he asked softly. I didn't know. I didn't realize what was happening." The words felt like a punch to Emily's gut. For so long she had longed for this moment, for her father to see the truth. But now that it was here, the weight of his neglect hit her harder than she ever could have imagined. She stood there, torn between the man who had once been her hero and the reality of what he had allowed to happen. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I can't stay here anymore. You didn't protect me, Dad. You didn't see what was happening." Her father's face fell, and he looked down ashamed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I failed you." But Emily didn't wait for him to say anything more. She didn't need to hear the empty apologies anymore. She had learned long ago that words meant nothing without action. She turned and ran, her father's voice calling after her. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't go back to that house, that life. For days, Emily traveled through the woods, over hills, and across streams. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. Every step was a step away from the pain, from the fear, from the life she had left behind. She found shelter in an abandoned cabin and made a small life for herself. It wasn't easy, but it was hers. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt free. Meanwhile, back at the farm, her stepmother was furious. She had spent days searching for Emily, but the girl was gone. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the household, and her father, still consumed by guilt, started to search too. But it was too late. Emily had made her escape, and there was no going back. Over time, Emily found her strength again. She built a new life, one where she wasn't defined by the cruelty of her past. She worked hard, learned new skills, and slowly began to heal. The scars of what she had endured would never fully fade, but she no longer let them control her. She had learned something important through it all. No one could take her power unless she allowed it. Years later, Emily would look back on those dark times with a sense of understanding. She realized that it wasn't just about escaping the abuse. It was about finding her own voice and refusing to be silenced. Her stepmother's cruelty, her father's neglect, it all shaped who she became. But it didn't define her. Emily was no longer the frightened girl in the barn. She was strong, capable, and free, and so, as she stood looking out over the land she had come to call home, Emily knew one thing for certain. She had survived, she had fought, and in the end, she had won. The darkness that had once threatened to swallow her whole had finally given way to the light. The story of her escape was not just about a girl fleeing from a cruel stepmother. It was about resilience, about the power of finding your own way in a world that tries to break you. Emily's journey was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. No matter how broken, no matter how beaten down, there is always hope